All right. With that, perhaps I will kick off this event. So welcome to all the participants and to our panelists who I'll introduce in a minute. My name is Navroz Dubash. I coordinate the initiative on climate, energy, and environment here at CPR. And I just want to take a second to sort of mention why we are the motivation behind doing this webinar. So as we all know, we are in this sort of pre-COP week. It's sort of ground zero in a sense for climate. It's the 2 weeks of the year where the world really sort of pays most attention to this issue. And there's a flurry of targets. There's a flurry of policies being announced by countries. Most recently, earlier today, by Australia. And we at CPR have, in a sense, had a parallel conversation we've been trying to get jumpstart. What we've been trying to argue is that long-term targets, as well as immediate policies, have a much greater chance of both being robust and being implemented if they're backed by institutional frameworks that are long-lasting, well thought through and robust. And of course, key to those institutional frameworks is our legal frameworks. So we've been trying to have a conversation about the laws and institutions that need to underpin national, but also subnational climate policies and commitments of various sorts. And indeed targets. So it's in that spirit that we've been also trying to have this conversation in India. We recently put out a special issue looking at this question of institutions in 8 different countries. And we have a parallel conversation we're trying to jumpstart in India. And this is the second of 2 webinars through which we've tried to do that. The first webinar looked at principles of climate law based on a paper that Anirudh wrote, my colleague Anirudh Sridhar. And this conversation aims to look at what the comparator cases are across the world. What are the sorts of cases India can learn from, in a sense? Because quite often when we talk about climate law, at least in India, the assumption is that this is the model that springs to mind is the UK model. And we are pleased to have somebody who can talk directly to that. But there are, of course, other models out there, which the panelists will also speak to. So we really want to explore what role can law play in this in the climate conversation, and what role can law play in India, given the peculiarities, like every country has, of India's legal context and environmental legal context in particular. So those are kind of the questions that we want to explore. And to lead us through this exploration, we're really pleased to welcome our former colleague here at CPR, Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta, who is currently a visiting professor, the Lawrence Rockefeller Professor for Distinguished Teaching at Princeton University. And we welcome him back as an honorary fellow here at CPR. Prior to this, he was, of course, Vice Chancellor at Ashoka University, and he's taught at a range of universities around the world. And in India, served on many government committees and has a whole array of prizes that I won't embarrass him with. But he's extremely distinguished, and we're very, very fortunate to have you here, Pratap. And thank you for being drawn into this conversation. I'm going to hand it over to you to take the conversation forward.
Thank you, Navroz, for your generosity, but more importantly, for putting together this panel, which I think is asking such fundamental questions, and I think you framed it really wonderfully. I mean, how do you create a legal framework that is sort of robust and sustainable? And we're really delighted and privileged to have a really outstanding panel with us. 3 people who really have been in the forefront, not just of thinking about these questions, but actually doing something about them. I'll quickly introduce them so that we don't have to then sort of spend much time sort of interrupting the flow of the panel. Professor Colin Reid, who will go first, is Professor of Environmental Law at the University of Dundee. And more, I think, pertinent to this panel, he's really served as one of the principal legal advisors to the Scottish and UK parliaments in thinking about climate framework legislation. We have Professor Deok Young Park from Yonsei University, South Korea, who's also on the advisory committee of the Korean National Assembly. And I think what makes this kind of, I think, panel distinguished is the fact that they both have kind of legislative advisory experience and academic experience. And this is, of course, reflected wonderfully in Dr. Olivia Rumble's bio as well, who is Director of Climate Legal, a leading environmental legal consultancy in South Africa, but really is also one of the principal architects of this astonishing legislation that South Africa has produced on climate frameworks. So welcome to all three of you. The proceedings will flow as follows. I'll just invite Anirudh Sridhar, who really is the kind of the secret behind all of this, kind of putting all these panels together, and whose concept notes have been widely circulated, to briefly introduce the subject. Then we will move to the panelists in the order in which they were listed: Professor Reed, Professor Park, and Dr. Rumble. I know Dr. Rumble has to leave slightly early, so we may, after the panelists speak, just open up space for maybe a quick discussion, 5 to 7 minutes, particularly in her presentation. And then I'll invite Shibani Ghosh and Navroz to comment on the panelists, and then we'll open it up for general discussion. So Anirudh, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Mehta, for your kind words. So I won't sort of act as the troll on the bridge, keeping you from your the panelists you came to see for too long. I'm just sort of, my plan is to mainly introduce certain concepts and features of climate laws that I think will facilitate the discussion better. So I'm just going to share PowerPoint very quickly. So the features that were presented in the concept note, or rather the way in which the climate laws have been broken down, is not set in stone. There have been many other ways in which it's been sliced and diced. My main reason for breaking it down into these features that you can see on your screen is because they function as a sort of the features that allow us to design climate laws easiest, rather than looking at it from a policy or content perspective. These are sort of mechanisms that are there in the law, which will allow us to contend with the great thing that is climate change. So in this particular presentation, I'm only going to talk about the ones that are highlighted here. For a more sort of comprehensive assay of the remaining features, you can have a look at the concept note that was earlier circulated. So coming to the first feature under discussion. So first of all, I'd sort of like to offer a sort of handy definition of framework climate laws. It's that I found in the Scotford and Minas paper, an overarching law that creates a unifying basis for climate policy. Really, that's the larger agenda of the designing exercise. How is it that we're going to add features together into the sort of rubric of the climate law in order to be able to effect a comprehensive, long-lasting, and cohesive climate policy? So the framework concept is sort of intended to be adequate, to be a mirror of the conception of climate change as a all of society, all of government problem. So if it is such a pervasive problem, how is the law going to be adequately pervasive to contend with that? So there are two ways in which we can look at the frameworkness of the law. The first one is the cross-sectorality of the law. So how does the climate law comprehend the various sectors of the economy that are already and might be, through future science, implicated in the climate effort? So that's basically what cross-sectorality is. So different laws have different sectors that they overtly recruit for this purpose, and some laws have more derivative mechanisms to then decide what sectors to include. I've given a list of a few sectors: energy, industry, that you can imagine might be included in this. Buildings, agriculture, transport, slightly more creative laws tend to include. So the larger sort of vision of the Framework Act is basically sort of can be seen, I think, in just mainly through examples rather than top-down theorizing. So the Peruvian law, I think, is a very good example of a framework act, which has the phrase incorporating an integral vision to promote the involvement of multiple sectors and members of society. And the Korean Framework Act of 2010, which now I hear is being superseded anon, says that the government shall rearrange infrastructure, including buildings, transportation, roads, and national infrastructure. I mean, Professor Park will correct me later if I'm wrong, but the word seems to also mean rearrange, reorganize, and restructure. So these are the sort of grand design principles that inform framework laws. In terms of how, in the horizontal axis, it attempts to comprehend. And now we'll look at the vertical axis. So how does the law come to terms with the relationship between the center and the states? That's basically what the federalism category is. And this, of course, is very important, equally important as the cross-sectorality element, because the actual implementation of these policies will happen on the ground by actors on the ground, and therefore the most proximate influencing factor is the local governmental level. And therefore the designers of the law have to keep in mind what kind of coercive degree of coercion would actualize or materialize the vision of the law in the best possible way. So some tend to have a very top-down approach, and some tend to have an extremely federated, or some tend to devolve power quite significantly. The German Act is an example. It's been written about quite significantly that it actually has an extremely federal, sort of federated approach to the distribution of power. It says the states can follow their own climate acts without prejudice to the federal act. So then under no obligation, really. And then the old South Korean law, the 2010 version, says that each local government shall fully cooperate in the state's measures for realizing low carbon green growth. So that's the other end of the spectrum. The next point I would like to talk about is called outcome duties. So oftentimes this is the feature of climate law that is considered to be the most salient and the most important, against which the efficacy of climate laws is often measured. Professor Reed, who's with us today, defines it as a duty not just to do something, but to ensure the achievement of a specified outcome, which depends on the conduct of a wide range of parties. Quite straightforwardly, the UK Climate Act says that the Secretary of State will ensure that the emissions by 2050 will be reduced at least by 100% vis-a-vis the 1990 levels. So this is not a duty to do some particular act, but to ensure the achievement of an act that involves many different parties. And then there are procedural duties, which are things that are intended to mainstream the act. So the ministries, depending on how invasive the Climate Act is, or how involving, depending on your outlook on it, it might involve private citizens even, but mostly it involves ministry officials and sometimes private sector individuals. It can be reporting duties, so X reports to Y to establish relationships and hierarchies. It can be consider duties. So when when designing buildings, consider the impacts on climate change or consider the right to climate. So various different types of ways in which individuals are sort of summoned to do things that are minimally influential in the short term, but are intended to mainstream the law, the climate issue in the long term. And the last thing I'll talk to you about is our climate bodies. So given the range of actors involved in the effort, oftentimes laws have institute new climate bodies whose functions are mainly to coordinate the various actors involved, advise the decision-making bodies on the emissions targets or adaptation requirements, and also generally to make these procedural duties robust and mainstream the act. And oftentimes the bodies are, or rather the bodies can be divided into two categories. One, the independent body, which isn't influenced by the, the shifting graces of politics in time, but at the same time, the body can also be under an executive, other executive body, the PMO, or the executive of the land, which gives it more heft and power to convene parties and actually be taken seriously and get things done. Yeah, and with that, I think we have the concepts established to carry this conversation forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Anirudh. I think for sort of laying out these concepts. So we'll jump right into the panel, and I'll first I'll invite Professor Colin Reid to begin the discussion.
Thank you. That's me unmuted, but I'm still seeing the slides that are.
Yes. Anirudh, you'll have to take down the slides.
I'm trying to do that now.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak. I'm speaking here from a very slightly cold and very wet Dundee, so I suspect that India's climate problems feel a bit different and on a day like this. So I'm going to say something really that matches fairly closely what you've just heard about some of the features of the climate legislation that is present in the UK. That's the Climate Change Act 2008, which is a UK statute. There's a separate Climate Change Scotland Act of 2009 that has slightly different features. Also, there's legislation in Ireland, which is more recent. And all of this has been amended. All of these legislation has been amended in fairly recent terms. When people think about climate legislation, they tend to think mainly about the headline target, the idea that the law is imposing a legal target to achieve net zero by 2050, 2045, reduced by so many percent, whatever the target is. And that attracts a lot of the attention, but by itself is actually of limited value. If you think about that sort of target as a simple legal obligation, I think by itself it's got a limited role. To begin with, as has been pointed out, it's often a very odd sort of duty, because you're not calling on the government to do something particular. You're calling on it to achieve an outcome, which depends on lots of actions over a long period by lots of different people, some of which the government can control directly, others of which it's got very loose control over unless you implement really draconian measures. So it's a slightly odd thing you're asking the government to do. It's also odd when you think about how are you going to enforce it? What's going to happen if the government doesn't actually comply? Because the reality is you're only going to know that the target has been missed 1, 2, 3 years later by the time all the monitoring, all the recording has taken place. Who is going to be entitled to sue on the basis that the government's failed to comply with its duty? You can't expect, it's unlikely that the Attorney General, Advocate General, whoever will sue their own government. So who in the public can sue? Is it absolutely anybody? Is it other authorities? Again, that will depend on the context of the individual jurisdiction, what the rules are on that. And then what's the remedy if the government hasn't complied with its obligation? In Ireland, they go out of their way to make clear that there's not going to be any liability for damages or compensation. In the UK, Scotland is left more open, but what would the court do 2 years after a target has been missed? What can the court do? It can make a declaratory statement that the law has not been complied with, but can it really order the government to do better? What would it actually require the government to do? Maybe to produce new plans or something like that. But it's a bit odd for sort of thing for the courts to do. Courts generally don't want to become hands-on in defining the policy, particularly in something as multifaceted as climate issues. So going to the court may not actually achieve much. So you've got to think not so much about the target in terms of this narrow legal duty, but what having a legal target means. Well, it means that you're committing not just this government, but future governments to a particular policy outcome. Yes, that can still be changed. If there's consensus in the legislature, you could change the Climate Act, but changing anything is going to be a fairly major step. It requires a positive formal step to move away from the commitment to meet the climate target. Because it's laid down in law, it's not as vulnerable to the erosion that naturally happens simply by redefinition, slightly recalculating things and so on. You've got a more lasting, enduring standard you're going to measure by. Because it's in the law, it's clearly going to be the job of some people in government to make sure you're working towards meeting it. And that can be very important, having somebody in the office who's going to have to say every few months, every year is going to come along and say, here, remember this, we've got to do something about it. They may still be shoved back into the cupboard, but at least somebody has an obligation to bring it forward. And having it as a legal obligation means that it should infuse into other areas of government activity as well, rather than just being a policy statement that you know is going to be changed after the next election, when there's the next reshuffle, new ministers come in and take account of it. So even if you don't think about the final headline target as being a really strong legal obligation in the sense it can be directly enforced, its presence in the law does make a difference compared to it simply being a policy statement. But the real value perhaps comes when you support the headline target, the headline obligation, with a number of other features. You support the target with other devices throughout the law. One thing is you can set interim targets. You can set, rather, as well as having your target for 2045, 2050, whatever, you can set closer targets, because that makes sure that the government, the people working in it, have to focus on actually making progress. It gives you an opportunity to test out, well, what does happen if the target is met, sort out the procedural issues and so on. And if an interim target has been met, making a declaratory order through the courts does actually have the chance of achieving something, because it's really kicking the government for the next interim target and the final one, rather than leaving it just to the end. So a series of interim targets can be useful. Also useful, a key feature of the British legislation is reporting obligations. You support the legal enforcement by enforcement through publicity and the political process. You do that by ensuring that there are reporting obligations. The government must monitor the progress it's doing. It must report to Parliament, report to the public on what it's been doing, and have these reports are then open to public criticism, political criticism, to scrutiny, to make sure what's happening. And again, by having to report every year, somebody's having to do this. It's a job in government that has to be kept going. And the fact that the reports are open to public criticism is important. It makes sure that there's no sliding, no slight moving of the goalposts, no readjustment, redefinitions that can change things in a way that actually get away from the point of the main target. And that public scrutiny, that exposure, is reinforced when you have an expert body looking at things as well. In UK, it's very much independent of government, and its role is to review progress, to produce its own reports on what should be happening, where we're going, to make sure that the government reporting is of appropriate quality, it's measuring the right things, it's tying in with what's happening at the international level as well. So that again, you've got this scrutiny of what the government is doing to make sure that everything is happening in the open, everything is open to expert scrutiny, so government can't just sort of quietly forget about the policy, can't just quietly put it in a drawer and forget about what's happening. But even these things by themselves are useful in setting the policy framework. But you can do more that does this. And the Scottish Act in particular does a number of other things that are really important in trying to make sure that climate issues are taken seriously. In the first place, the legislation requires a whole series of plans to be produced by government. They've actually got to do some thinking about how they're going to get towards the climate target. So there's the big high-level climate change plan. There's a specific adaptation plan to deal with how we're going to cope with the changing circumstances that we are creating. And then plans on a number of other issues that are important for climate, for land use, for energy efficiency, for renewable heat. We've more in Scotland, we've got lots of renewable electricity. We can generate that quickly, but a big source of greenhouse gas emissions is heating our buildings, particularly in the winter. So there's a separate policy on renewable heat. So the legislation is requiring the government to focus on these particular issues, requiring them to develop the plans that will feed into the wider national plan. You then, in the legislation again in Scotland, you're trying to bring in other parties to support and to be partners in the activity of endeavour of reaching a better climate position, particularly the public sector. So there's a duty on all public sector bodies to support climate change targets and adaptation. And again, more importantly, that's supported by detailed reporting obligations. So every year, public sector bodies, including the universities, have to report on what they're doing in relation to climate issues, the new rules coming in. We're going to have to have our own target date for reaching net zero, the plans, the policies we're going to use to get that, how that integrates into our investment and capital decisions, so on and so forth. So again, you're trying to make sure that it's a shared endeavour, that everybody has to play a part in this. And the other thing that the Climate Change Scotland Act is doing, and some other bits of legislation, is actually trying to tackle some of the issues in the wider law. That in the past centuries, the law in most Western countries has developed on a model that's thinking about things on an individualistic, a short-term basis that recognizes only commercial interests. And that sort of thinking is embedded in all sorts of areas of law and has to be changed if we're going to deal with climate issues effectively, because they require long-term thinking, collective thinking, thinking that values nature rather than just commercial values. So when you look at other bits of law, you'll find all sorts of obstacles, all sorts of things that get in the way of useful things to climate. And I'll give two examples from Scotland, based again on our big issue of heating homes and buildings in winter. I have been in India. I know that in most of India, your issues are a bit different, but for Scotland, heating is a big issue. One of these is to try to promote district heating, where rather than having each house having its own small, fairly inefficient gas boiler, you have a large boiler providing heat for a whole area. Something that happens quite a lot in continental Europe. It's not been a feature anywhere in Britain, largely. But moving to a district heating system goes against the ethos of individual, sorry, I've got an energy saving light. I've got to keep moving to not moving enough to keep it going. You've got to, if you're moving to a district heating system, you're going against the ethos of everybody looking after their own little bit of property in a system that's open to competition, where price is the only thing that matters. So you're trying to create a new legislative framework that allows district heating to work. That means you've got to have measures to protect consumers from what is in effect a monopoly supplier. You have to make sure that the people installing, maintaining the system have access to all the properties. They can put in the pipes, they can put in all the equipment that's needed. And if you don't make legislative steps to allow that, you're stuck with a system where each person's on their own individually, not contributing. You're contributing to the problem rather than joining in the solution. And the other simple example is an example I like. It's in some ways it's an obscure one, but I think it's good because it shows the reach that's involved here. And that is to do with apartment buildings. If you've got a tenement, a building where there are lots of different people own their own flats in the one building, the law's been changed so that the fitting of energy efficient measures is now seen as being as a matter of maintenance rather than as being an improvement to the building. And the crucial thing is that under the general law of the tenement, the general law to do with shared buildings, if something is a matter of maintenance, you don't need all the owners to consent to it, and everybody has to contribute to the cost. So energy efficiency measures can now go ahead so long as the majority of people in the building are happy. It's not something that one owner can veto, and so long as it goes ahead, all the owners have to contribute to the cost of it. And that's a tiny little simple technical change in the law of property, but it actually gets rid of an obstacle to improving the quality of housing, improving the energy efficiency of housing in parts of Scotland. So when you think about climate laws, you need to think, yes, about the headline target, think about what it means, not just as a legal, as a strict legal target, but how it's going to influence the way government works all the way down, but it needs to be supported by a whole host of other measures, particularly reporting, expert advisory bodies to provide scrutiny and so on, and then thinking about how you're making government plan for the future, how you're getting rid of obstacles in other parts of the law. And that's more than enough from me, so thank you.
Thank you, Professor Reid, for really kind of compelling and clear presentation. I'm sure we'll come back to it. I'll quickly turn over to Professor Park. Welcome, Professor Park. We can formally welcome you and look forward to your presentation. You're on mute again, Professor Park.
Okay, just
yeah, that's okay. Better. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the invitation. But well, the problem is that always English matters. I'm not English native speaker, so I might be a bit slower. I guess already your research center knows much about Low Carbon Act in 2010. But recently, at the end of August, Korean National Assembly passed the Framework Act on carbon neutrality and green growth. It's not entered into force yet. Next March, it will be entered into force. The 2010 Act was more focused on green growth, economic growth. At that time, because it was under the Conservative Party, they think more on economic growth. Current Korean government is a Democratic Party, so they think more about environment. So the current government saw that the 2010 Act is not enough for carbon neutrality or environmental integrities. So they enacted a new act called the Framework Act on Carbon Neutrality and Green Growth. Originally, the name was the Framework Act on Carbon Neutrality, but the Conservative Party urged that to include the green growth to the law. So green growth was added, but the short title is the Korean Carbon Neutrality Act. So it's to implement Paris Agreement, basically. Before that, I think you have to understand the Korean situation of carbon emission. As I know, the UK has reached the peaking in 1990. But in 1990, Korean emission of carbon was 292 million. And then 2018, after 28 years, it has been increased to 727 million tons. So it's more than doubled, 2.5 times. So even though European countries, they acted already from 1990s, but at that time, Korea was not thinking much about emission reductions. So from 292 in 1990, 727 in 2018. So now we think 2018, we have reached the peaking. So from 2018, we are going to reduce carbons. So this new act has a two key elements. The first one is by 2050, we are going to reach carbon neutrality. And second, we are going to upgrade 2030 nationally determined contributions. So according to the old version, which was submitted in 2015, Korean INDC, at that time, it was about 26% decrease, 26% reduction compared to 2017. But now our NDC, Korean NDC, is going to be 40% reduction compared to 2018. So it's a very hard task. So this carbon neutrality by 2050 and upgrade of NDC is in the new act. According to act itself, the new NDC 2030 must be more than 35% reduction. But during the deliberation by the 2050 Carbon Neutrality Committee, we have increased it to at least 40% reduction. This new law established 2050 Carbon Neutrality Commission to deliberate governmental policy and decide whether the governmental policy is enough or not. And then every government is going to deliver various policy options for climate changes. And whenever we have environmental impact assessment, we are going to add climate change impact assessment as well. And we are going to establish climate response fund to use for the good cause. And just the transition are also included in the act, and the climate justice concept is included in the act as well. So the Carbon Neutrality Committee will be the control tower to implement carbon neutrality policies. So government makes a plan, and then 2050 CNC is going to deliberate, think over whether the governmental policy is enough or not. In the new act, Korea officially acknowledged the crisis of climate change and then announced the greenhouse gas reduction target. According to law, it's a 35%, but during the deliberation by 2050 CNC, Carbon Neutrality Committee, it has been increased to 40% reduction. And not just the mitigation issues, it has many provisions on adaptation. And by the law, it's a 35% reduction, and then by the CNC deliberation, 40% reduction, and by 2050, carbon neutrality, we are going to accomplish. And then for the target, every 5 years, Korean government is going to make national strategy plan to achieve the target. Not just in central government level, in province level and the local government level as well. They are going to make every 5 years the strategy plan, and then it's going to be reviewed by the CNC. And this new law adopted a market mechanism for compliance as well, and eco-labeling to promote eco-friendly products. And it has provisions on public education for carbon neutrality and the green products as well. As Professor Rader mentioned, we have a reporting obligation as well. Central government, local government, and every province, they must report what they have achieved. And then it will be reviewed by the 2050 CNC, Carbon Neutrality Committee. And in this act, we have a very high-level target, they say, because Korea has much focused on economic development for the past. Now, the focus is changing under the President Moon's government. Of course, it has been affected by the inauguration of President Biden in the United States. About the point you asked me to touch on, my thoughts on the best ways to integrate development, growth, and with climate action in the law, we have included every point to make carbon reduction in the new law. But the problem is that Korean industries, they think 40% reduction by 2030 is too much. Always they are saying that. And on the other hand, the civil society is saying that 40% by 2030 is not enough. So there is a conflicting opinions in the newspapers every day. In some sense, Korean industries, they know that they have to go for eco-friendly products. They have to change their attitude. Behind the scene, I think they are asking governmental subsidy to change the business attitude or business habits. But generally speaking, Korean industries are very quick at action. So the trend is not reversible. Korean industries know that. So I guess they are going to change or follow rapidly the global trend for eco-friendly products, etc. And the second point, what are the main mechanisms in the law to build capacity in different economic sectors for mitigation and adaptation? In the new law, we have just a transition concept, and we are going to establish just a transition support center. So the energy poor or environmentally disadvantaged people, to help them, government is going to have some policies. We have so far the CNC 2050 CNC was made in May, just 5 months ago, and for the past 5 months we have dealt with NDC upgrade, and then making scenarios of carbon neutrality by 2050. And then after this COP26, from November, we are going to focus on how to implement our plans. We are going to make detailed plans to accomplish NDC 2030 and the carbon neutrality by 2050. So just the transition support center and the climate justice concept is included. It will help for the people to move forward to climate neutrality. And what's the last point? What's the advantages and disadvantages of a new carbon neutrality act compared to 2010 Low Carbon Act? I would say this new law reflects much stronger will, both from the government and especially from the current president. The problem is that the term for the current president is going to be finished next May. So next March, we are going to have a presidential election. Generally speaking, Democratic Party is more eco-friendly, environment-friendly. The Conservative Party is more focusing on economic development. But considering current global trend, even though the Conservative Party leader becomes new president, I think this trend is not going to be changing. And the other point is that people are much more supportive than in 2010. So especially younger generations, they are supporting current governmental position. So overall, the future for carbon reduction in Korea, I think it's much more brighter than before. Okay, for other things, I will answer to the question later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Park, and particularly, I think, kind of bringing in the climate justice dimension and how law might actually capture that. We now turn over to Dr. Olivia Rumble. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Pratap, and thanks, other colleagues. It was really interesting to hear what's happening elsewhere in the world. Down here in South Africa, we've just presented, or the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment has just presented a draft climate change bill to our parliament. And, you know, there's a lot of rumors going on that they're hoping to skid it in just before COP26. I don't think that's going to happen. But I think the hope is for the South African government to go to COP26 and say we have a climate change bill before Parliament. I was part of the drafting process in 2018 when we led the drafting team together with the department. And the reason it's taken so long to get to Parliament is that it's been held up in a body which we call NEDLAC in South Africa, which is sort of a labor and business negotiation council, and dealing with just this issue of the just transition. And it's interesting to hear what's happening in South Korea and how a framework law might potentially provide for that in an operative mechanism. During that 3-year process, some smallish changes were made to the bill to give effect to the just transition, just by massaging the language. And ultimately, the draft that we've seen come out of it hasn't changed too materially, except for the provisions around the institutional body. And I did prepare some slides on this, but it's so refreshing to see people's faces as they talk. I think I'm not going to pull them up. I'm just going to talk broadly about our bill. But if you have any questions, I've got the provisions close by, so I can happily bring them onto the screen. So what I found very refreshing about the climate change bill in South Africa is that it tries very hard to meet these dual priorities of adaptation and mitigation. And, you know, like India, South Africa, and the rest of the world, but particularly as a developing country, we are extremely vulnerable to climate change. As a continent, we are extremely vulnerable. And you'll see in our NDCs at under the Paris Agreement, we constantly prioritize adaptation over mitigation. That's not to say that South Africa is necessarily innocent from a mitigation point of view. We were in there with the top 20 emitters. We have the largest single point CO2 emission source in the world. We've just built the world's largest air-cooled coal-fired power plant. And so we have some difficult policy and in return related legal challenges that we need to overcome. And what's interesting about this bill is that it tries to really prioritize adaptation, but it also dances a very delicate line in trying to get different government departments to speak to each other and to cooperate with each other. And I don't think that's unique to us. I notice a lot of framework laws do this, but it's in the context of a South African situation where our National Department of Energy is in charge for energy policy and planning, and it is responsible for developing these policy instruments called our Integrated Resource Plan. And that's more like an energy blueprint for the next 10, 20, 30 years, including our mix of nuclear versus coal versus renewables. And the concern is, how does the department, which is essentially mandated of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, which has an environmental mandate, put forward a bill that adequately includes the Department of Energy and effectively regulates their mandate to develop these energy blueprints for the country, and try and participants put it as a word of trying to control the Department of Energy. Obviously, this is a law that will be passed by Parliament and is ultimately, owned as a public document by Parliament. So it's not necessarily the departments, but it was very important to get the Department of Energy's buy-in and support during the drafting process for them to simultaneously engage with the provisions that would effectively place controls and limits over their mandate to determine the country's energy mix. So we have a very centralized way of determining our energy mix in the country. And for that reason, what the bill tries to achieve quite a lot is to have provisions that give general boundaries. Now, I'll talk through the details in a bit, to the different government departments and ministries, but then give them the autonomy to determine how they want to work within those boundaries. Similarly, a broad requirement to come up with policies and plans within those different departments, but then again, autonomy on the actual content of those plans. So again, it really tries to be a framework law and to put procedures and instruments in place to facilitate climate change mainstreaming, but doesn't mandate the specifics. It also, in its original inception, and this is quite true of a lot of South African laws, tries quite hard to create forums for intergovernmental coordination, or methods through which different government departments can talk to each other, and also a level of authority of who would have a final decision-making vote, for instance. And I mention this because we see it in our, for example, marine planning instruments that are coming out. So our newer legislation in South Africa is very focused on trying to reduce intergovernmental conflict and promote coordinated action. So an oft-repeated phrase you'll hear in South Africa is the lack of policy coherence, intergovernmental disputes, and a failure to provide a unified response. So ambitiously, this particular bill tries to some degree, overcome some of those internal conflicts. There was also a lot of discussion and debate about how would we frame this law in the context of what is often described as a very fragmented and very populated, it's not really environmental, but environmental legal landscape. So in South Africa, we have a very, very dense environmental law system, and the public felt, it would be too much to now add another law onto the broad suite of laws we already have. but it was felt that the gravitas of a framework law, the fact that it would be a single point reference, and the fact that it would on its own distinguish itself from being purely an environmental issue and be more of a cross-sectoral issue, warranted the fact that it should be a separate bill, because many people felt, can't we just break it up and insert it into other different existing laws? So that was a lot of the thinking that went behind the structure of the bill. In terms of its content, what it seeks to create is a multitude of institutional mechanisms. As Anirudh already pointed out, that is very much a fundamental component of these laws. So in the South African instance, it was originally conceived of as a ministerial committee. Over a period of years and during negotiation, it is now a body called the Presidential Climate Commission. And that body is chaired by our president. So it tries to elevate the authority decision-making power right to the apex of government. And it includes the participation of labor, academia, civil society, etc. But it is a little sparse on detail on how that particular body will function. I think the thinking is that those rules and procedural requirements will be developed later. That commission has actually already been established, so the laws come a little bit late, but it will retrospectively authorize and empower its mandate. Another complaint by local government and provincial government was that they were happy to have institutional mechanisms at their own provincial and local level, but they didn't want to recreate the wheel. And so, forgive me, it might be the South Korean law that has a similar approach, but the thinking was to rather incorporate a climate change mandate within existing local and provincial structures. So to repurpose those vehicles, but also to require them to take climate change into account. Those two bodies, or at least those two spheres of government, are required to consider their climate change vulnerabilities and to undertake an assessment and then to propose their own measures on how to respond to those vulnerabilities. It also requires national government to develop a national adaptation strategy, which has already been done. So the bill is a little bit late in that regard. And that strategy is to respond to national adaptation objectives and is required to be reviewed every 5 years. So it's meant to be a fresh and a relatively living document. Similarly, the bill also identifies various other government departments that have adaptation or at least climate change vulnerabilities. For example, health. And the Department of Health is equally required to develop a Department of Health adaptation plan, for instance, to deal with climate change impacts. When it comes to mitigation, the bill tries to reflect our NDC position. So most recently, South Africa submitted its revised NDC, and it committed to a trajectory, to a range between two trajectories. One upper range is compatible with a 2-degree future, and the bottom of the range is compatible with a 1.5-degree future. And as a country, we've agreed to fit somewhere in between that range. And what the bill does is say the minister, in consultation with the Presidential Commission, is empowered to set this trajectory, so it becomes a legal thing. An interim trajectory is annexed to the bill as a legally binding, it's not really binding, but for want of a better word, as a legally established trajectory. And once established, that trajectory is then used to inform this thing we call sectoral emission targets, or sets. And I usually describe it to my students as, imagine a pie, and that pie is our national emissions trajectory. And the Minister of Environmental Affairs, in consultation with the Presidential Climate Commission, is empowered to divide that pie up between different government ministries. So it would be Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Transport, Ministry of Agriculture, etc., etc. And once that budget or sectoral target is allocated, that individual ministry must then develop policies and measures. So it must take its existing plans. For instance, the Department of Energy would reinterrogate the integrated resource plan and would need to revise it however it chooses to do so, in order to meet that sectoral emissions target for the Department of Energy. So the Department of Energy may choose to increase the nuclear percentage of the IRP. It may choose to increase the amount of renewables. It's entirely up to that department how it does so, as long as it achieves that target. It then has, as Colin was pointing out, very sort of key reporting functions. So it is required to report to Cabinet and to the President on how the extent to which those targets have been achieved. In South Africa, we have a common law system that empowers civil society to interdict government. So whilst there is no criminal sanction if the minister doesn't achieve that target, it would be possible for a civil society organization, and we have a very litigious one, to approach the court and require an interdict for a minister to achieve its target. So that's effectively the compliance mechanism. And then lastly, at a company level, so we have sectoral targets at a sector level. At a company level, the minister is empowered to allocate carbon budgets. And that would effectively be, to borrow the UK's terminology, an allowance to an individual company, usually of a medium to large emission scale, to emit up to a particular amount. And the major issue that we've encountered, and what's caused so much delay to date, is that companies are already paying a carbon tax, and they felt that this was a double punitive measure. And so they've amended it now so that if you're an individual company and you go above your carbon budget, you are now going to have to pay a higher carbon tax. So it's an interesting amalgamation of tax law with a national framework climate change law. We've yet to see how that's going to work. And lastly, I'm sorry, I omitted to mention, there's a general mainstreaming provision. So the whole of the Act tries to weave mainstreaming of climate change into existing policies and plans, but there's a dedicated provision that says every government department that undertakes an activity that is involved with the environment or climate change has to revise its existing policies and plans and decisions in order to take climate change considerations into account. It's an extremely broad provision. It's going to be very difficult to implement in practice, but it's ambitious. And then lastly, we don't have any provisions in the Act dealing with the Climate Change Trust Fund. We've seen some successful examples like Seychelles develop those type of instruments, but we don't have it in this particular Act. Civil society really wanted to see something like that. And personally, I'm very interested in those types of instruments. But at the moment, historic experience with dedicated trust funds in South Africa hasn't been that successful. So they avoided it for that reason. And that's all from my side.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rumball. I know you have to leave. So what we'll do is we'll maybe just share a couple of questions with you before you leave. I'll invite Professors Reid and Park if they have any sort of reactions to Dr. Rumball's presentation. But a couple of that have come up to the chat box, and I think they're probably all on our minds. I think one is, I think, an obvious one, which is in some sense this very tricky question of sort of the tension between the autonomy you grant to individual ministries and the standards to which you hold them accountable. And is there something in South Africa's sort of bureaucratic and institutional culture from the past that you think will actually make this work? I mean, in some senses, the process is kind of very nicely designed, but in the end, it is actually about actual cultures of negotiation in some senses. So are there any kind of valuable kind of lessons there? And the second, I think the kind of the big interesting thing, which is that given that you have this kind of presidential position really under kind of executive authority, to what extent are there fears about not just the kind of political capriciousness of the executive authority, but really typically, as we've seen in at least contexts like India, wherever you have executive power directly involved, in some senses, the rest of the procedural stuff becomes perhaps a little less salient, or it's more taking off. So how does the kind of role of executive authority fit into this? Maybe if you could take those two questions while our colleagues come in.
Thanks, Pratap. Great questions, actually. So in relation to your most recent one, I think there was quite a concern from stakeholders that there was too much authority and insufficient oversight around the executive. And the original ministerial climate change coordinating commission was subsequently abandoned and made a far more participatory body, and including labor, civil societies, academia. And what's quite interesting, and it gives a bit of a window into the future, is that because that body has already been constituted, what it did was review South Africa's draft NDC earlier on this year. And it actually criticized the NDC and said this thing could be far more ambitious. And subsequently, the NDC was reviewed to be slightly more ambitious. So we really have some promising insights that this could be an effective body, and that it takes its role relatively seriously and to a degree independently. It still obviously has government on it. What would be nice to see in the bill is a bit more provisions around the effects of a decision by that body. At the moment, it's a little bit opaque, but we'll possibly see that when it goes through Parliament. When it comes to implementation, I think that was also a concern echoed by a lot of civil society. And the way that the bill has been crafted is to be very, very specific around timeframes. So, for example, it goes within 1 year into operation of this act, the Minister of Environmental Affairs must develop a national adaptation strategy, must review it within 5 years. And the same for all of the other mandatory provisions. So there's a whole Gantt chart of actions that need to happen as soon as the law is passed, which it is helpful that we have a very active civil society that could probably go to court and mandate government to implement those instruments or develop them and finalize them within the mandated timeframes. So we do have a relatively receptive legal culture. I do worry that it will be, we have many laws that aren't implemented in South Africa. We're very good at drafting policies. We're excellent at doing laws. We're not so great at implementing. So as excited as I am about the bill, I think, like any country, it will take us some time to figure it out. It took us 10 years to operationalize our air quality laws. So goodness knows whether we actually have the time scientifically to bring this bill truly into effect. But my hope is that with the right bottom-up support, we do have the culture to do so.
Thank you so much. Professor Reid and Park, if you have a quick question for Dr. Rumble before we let her go and turn to the discussants. Professor Reid?
Not so much a question, just an observation that in the UK, climate change seems to be seen as being very much an all-government idea. The Prime Minister has power in it, whereas if you look at the plans that are being done on other areas of the environment, a common concern is that it's clearly the Environment Department's business, and the buy-in that you need from the Treasury, Transport, other departments in order to make the environment plan work just isn't there. By chance, I think, climate's been seen as something that does spread across government, so the way it's currently located gives it that overview. But I think there is a real problem in all countries that the battles between different bits of government which are more or less enthusiastic about climate and other environmental matters.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Reid. So thank you, Dr. Rumble. And of course, you're free to stay on. We'd love to have you. But in case you need to leave, feel free. We will now turn to our respondents, the panelists. Rose, of course, needs no introduction, and particularly delighted that Dr. Shibani Ghosh is leading off the discussion. She's one of India's leading environmental lawyers and has, I think, written probably some of the best, I think, accounts of how environmental jurisprudence actually operates in India. So Shibani, I don't know whether you want to go first or Navroz, but I can, Shibani, the floor is yours.
Yeah, but Unnecessary generous of you, Pratap, but thank you so much. This is a fascinating discussion, and I really don't want to take up too much time, which I'm sure we'd like to hear from our speakers here. But just a few kind of reflections, something that actually Dr. Rumble said just before. It's really, the implementation is such an important part of this whole discussion on legal and policy framework, and very much so in the Indian context as well. Just kind of reflections on what our speakers said. I think what Professor Reed said really resonated with me, that even if the law doesn't work in terms of meeting the timelines or in kind of meeting the targets, just the fact that there is a law which acknowledges the importance of climate change as a problem, not only in terms of the vulnerability of our country, setting mitigation requirements, adaptation challenges. I think that symbolic importance certainly needs to be reiterated, and I think India needs to move down that path. The second issue, I think, which is important for India and which I'm hoping a law in India could actually help us with, is something our speakers spoke about, which is intergovernmental coordination, kind of facilitating that coordination and that kind of conversation, not just vertically, but also horizontally. So both kind of speaking to our federal structure, national and subnational actors, but across ministries and departments, because obviously this is an all of government problem, and an Indian law which speaks to this, particularly if it's a framework law that we've kind of, Anirudh spoke about, and our speakers after that also reflected on. It has to be something that, provides the forums, as well as in some way or form gives that structure to this kind of a facilitated coordination. And it's not that we've not seen that happen in some of the Indian laws, which have kind of interministerial bodies, which have had some form of success, particularly in the environmental field. Some have not, but there's a lot to learn from. We've had bodies in place for a couple of decades, and we can learn what worked, what didn't work in those kind of institutions. And there's a lot. I think and just final few points. One is, of course, Professor Reed spoke about it, and Dr. Rumble, about the role of courts. The Indian courts, and Dr. Mehta has written so much about it, is just, it could be just what you could come to the courts for anything, get anything, or get nothing. That could kind of work in both ways, cut both ways for us, because in some senses, you could come to our Indian courts without any form of legal standing, but get a fantastically progressive order. But you could also come to our Indian courts with an absolutely rock solid, tight, solid case, but go back with, just totally disheartened and not knowing what to do with what came out of the court. So, the role of courts in this kind of Indian courts have traditionally been extremely reluctant to enter issues of policy making, particularly economic policy making, where issues of infrastructure building are an issue. But at the same time, we've seen them, actively interfering in other issues. And finally, just the question of just transition and climate justice. I think India is, a perfect example where these issues are right on top for us. They have to be very much part of the objectives, the preambular context in which a law on climate is brought about in India. And already there are a lot of conversations on just transition, particularly in the coal sector. And I think there are other legislative examples from which we can learn, and certainly from why they have not worked, if nothing else. So I think, thank you so much for the speakers. There's a lot to think about and reflect in our own kind of Indian jurisprudence and the way it's evolved. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shivani. Rose?
Thank you. I'm really anxious to hear from the speakers as well as from you, actually, Pratap. So I will literally just take a minute to flag just a couple of things really about what I'd like to hear more from the speakers. We heard quite a lot from Professor Park about the new law, but in a sense, I would actually be very keen to hear from him about the 2010 law, which was more oriented, as I understand it, towards green growth, and also whether there's kind of a sequencing dynamic at work here, where a law is sort of set up in a way where it is much more procedural, it is much more facilitative of green growth, and then there's a transition over time to something where it's much more explicit about sort of carbon neutrality and so on. So I would love to hear a little bit more about that. I was very struck by Dr. Rumble's point that there were these kind of institutional spots created So when an NDC had to be reconsidered, there was an institutional kind of a structure in place that took on that task. So the role of law, of actually building these institutional vessels that are ready when you need them, I thought was a really important point. From Professor Reed, among other things, I was just trying to envision, he painted a picture about how challenging it is to actually act on outcome duties. And in the Indian legal context, I could just see those challenges being multiplied so much more. And it just sort of reinforces in me a sense that a kind of a procedural approach rather than thinking in terms of outcome duties would be much more suitable for India. And I also want to just pick up on Pratap's point about executive power. And it just strikes me that, we've seen things in the Indian press saying India should appoint a climate czar. And that sort of implies that the only challenge is actually getting things done, but we know what has to be got done. But from all of these, it sounds like a lot of the legal structure is about figuring out what needs to be done and how you actually manage to create, what do you do once you create a kind of injunction to mainstream? There's not a ready answer, actually. And I think for India to learn that it's not about implementing something we already know has to be done, but you need actually a process of mediating among competing interests and figuring out actually what you have to do. So the creation of plans, strategies, and so on are actually quite an important part of what needs to be enabled by law. Thanks, Pratap.
Thank you so much. So I'll turn to our panelists for a quick response to the comments, Navroz's questions, anything else you want to add. And just a request to our audience, please type in your questions in the Q&A or chat box. We'll try and communicate them to the speakers. Professor Park, would you like to go first? Particularly the point about the 2010 law, and are there any lessons to be learned from the way in which that operated?
Actually, 2010 law and the 2021 law, actually they are quite similar. But the problem is the government attitude towards the law. Even though Korea enacted in 2010 Green Growth Act, at that time people did not much focus on climate change issues. And the government as well, their catchphrase was green growth. But actually, they did not implement that act quite actively. So it was a bit dormant. But now, in 2021, the situation and the people's mind changed quite a lot. So now, the 2021 law is much more in detail. And currently, we have a framework act itself, but the government is preparing presidential decree for much more detailed rules. That's what I'm saying.
So I think that's a useful reminder about the kind of implementation context. Professor Reed, any quick reactions?
I think just two things. Firstly, on a point that was raised in one of the questions and answers, I've put in the question and answer box the phrasing for the just transition principles that are embedded in the Scottish Act. The Scottish ministers have to have regard to just transition in developing the climate plan. So there's an idea of what is meant by that, but it's a very vague, very broad concept. I think in terms of structures and frameworks, a lot obviously depends on the formal and the informal constitutional arrangements in the individual countries, where power lies, how things go together. You talked about the different levels of government working together. Well, we've got the Scottish Climate Change Act and the one for the whole UK. Scottish government has consistently tried to be more ambitious than the UK government on this, which actually can create tensions rather than ease things. And there are notable policy differences over things like the role of nuclear power. So you've got to be, by having the different layers, it can be a way of helping coordination. It can also, though, be a way of creating further points of tension. Even though you're moving in the same general direction, there may be notable differences that political arguments on both sides want to exploit.
Thank you. I mean, I think just one thought while we kind of take questions from the audience, which is running through my mind, listening to all three presentations and then Rose and Shivani's comments. And let me put it this way, I mean, is there a case to be made that it is actually premature for India to adopt a framework law? Because particularly listening to Professor Reed's presentation, so there are a couple of things obviously a framework law could do. It could set a general target, net zero by 2050 or 2060. It's a good thing to have, but you can express it in very different ways, which is that what gives the law its specificity and its edge in Professor Reed's presentation, and I think implicitly now Professor Park's kind of account of the revised Korean law, is that at the background there seems to be something of a strategy in place, right? Which is to say that you already have not just a developmental vision that we want, carbon zero carbon growth, we want to be to shift, but some fairly specific ideas of what actually that national strategy would involve. And in some senses, law can function as an instrument for implementing that developmental strategy. But in the absence of that, or at least some sense of what that is, I mean, what kinds of instruments are we using? Are we using financial instruments? Are we using taxation instruments? Which are the 3 or 4 sectors we are actually prioritizing? That in the absence of that, it seems to me a pretty thickly worked out framework convention is not only not going to be possible, but probably counterproductive. And really the way to go is, in a sense, the point that Navroz is making is, which is how do you actually get consultative processes and political and administrative processes that actually help you craft such a strategy. And to be a little bit contrarian, which is to say, that old adage political scientists use, which is at one level, you already have all the mechanisms to be able to do that. In principle, you have those forms to be able to do that. There's nothing preventing a council of states getting together to do it. There's in some senses nothing preventing even our current structures of cabinet government preventing, to create those. And so if they're not happening, is it the case that the enactment of a law specifying more procedures will actually get you the right kind of consultation to get to that strategy, which can then be converted into some kind of a framework, right? Much has been made of this point, I think, by all the speakers, which I think is absolutely right. And I think it's said in another paper that one of the things that makes climate change tricky is that it's a cross-sectoral issue, right? It's, at one level, it impacts pretty much every decision we might make, practically, kind of in economic terms. But at one level, that's also not the case because it impacts differential sectors and different constituencies very, very differently. So, for example, one of the things I worry about when I see the South African law, for example, or if you want to translate that to the Indian context, is that if you give regulators these detailed powers, right, to monitor, to sort of, say every level of government must come up with an appropriate climate plan. Given India's political economy, I'm pretty sure the compliance burden and the intervention burden is going to actually fall on smaller actors far more disproportionately than it is actually going to fall on big actors. And so wouldn't it be better, right, rather than kind of, give these omnibus powers, every department produce this plan, every actor produce this plan. And I'm pretty sure in India, it will actually be basically in every housing society comes up with a plan, right? Wouldn't it be better to actually upfront state the development strategy and say, look, these are the priority sectors. You need law that can ensure compliance in these particular sectors. Rather than actually, in some senses, I think, create a culture where, because it's cross-sectoral and because technically it's true that everybody has to, it impacts everybody. I think the general experience of law in India is that, it's like our land acquisition laws, that in some senses it's actually the compliance burden is going to fall on most of those who are least in position of resisting it. And when I read some of, these laws, I think that's my big fear in the Indian context. It's not going to target the big players. It's going to actually empower all these procedural requirements to actually go and harass ordinary citizens who actually least impact on actually what's going to happen. So I think it might be worth thinking of what are the political economy principles of procedural design, rather than, you might say the normative principles of procedural design that might help us design procedures that actually, ward against these kinds of things. But that's just to provoke discussions. We'll take questions from the audience, if any. I think there's one question that has come up. I'll just throw it out to the panelists, Professor Park, which has to do with, in a sense, financing in some ways, which is, to what extent do you see the different framework laws in Korea and in Scotland and England and UK being able to address at least some of the financing questions that are actually critical to addressing issues of climate change? I think Dr. Ramal also mentioned this. So I don't know if there are any particular thoughts on how a framework convention might help financing.
I think that a lot of the financing is international rather than national. So our domestically focused national law isn't the place to expect the answers to that. I think the big financing issues are the international ones. But what I think a national law can do, and it comes back to the comments that were being made earlier about the strategy, is that absolutely the law can't necessarily sort out the strategy. But we've been talking about climate change for over 40 years. I remember being at talks long ago where meteorologists talking about the certainty of climate change and what was going to happen, and nothing has happened. So what a climate change law can do is actually force the governments who have the various layers of government, the various branches of government that have the powers, actually to think about it and to come forward with a strategy, which is an improvement on where we've been for the last 40 years. You then have to think about what the strategy is going to be and the implementation with all the dangers that have been raised. But as a way of nudging or pushing hard the various people who've been doing nothing for decades actually to do something, there is a value there.
Professor Park, I don't know if you had any thoughts on the financing question.
Sorry, I couldn't understand your question exactly. Would you do that again?
No, so the question that's come up in a sense to which I thought is, at least some people assume that one of the challenges to implementing climate change related laws is the question of financing. You also mentioned the example of Korean industry in some sense asking for subsidies behind the scenes. And is there something in the framework laws that would actually help us think about the question of financing, perhaps a bit more creatively than we have so far? Or is that something that's just sort of in the background, but really the framework does not give you instruments to address any of the financing questions?
The sound is going and coming, so I don't understand exactly your question. But anyway, about financing issues. Your question was about finance?
Yes,
financing issues?
yes. Can law help us? Can the framework laws help us address some of the financing questions that arise in the context of debates about climate change? Or just to take the example that you gave, which is that Korean manufacturers asking for subsidies Could they actually use a law like this to perhaps leverage more subsidies for achieving a particular objective, or will the law really play no role in how these subsidies eventually get allocated?
Okay, the Korean industries are talking much about climate change issues, and they say it's quite difficult to respond to sharp reduction, such as 40% in 9 years. But in my opinion, they already knew that without the change of their attitude, they cannot survive in the world market. Why they are talking about the difficulties to come to climate change issues? Behind the scene, they are asking governmental subsidies. So my position is that not to provide them too much subsidy. They should act by themselves. Korea is basically developing country for the past 10, 20, 30 years. So the Korean industries knows that if they are asking and asking, the government responds. But we have to stop that habit, that attitude. But in the new law, in the case of small and medium enterprises, when they have difficulties because of climate crisis issues, the small and the medium companies, when they want to change their business, then the government is going to support them. It's kind of just transition.
Right. Thanks. Rose, you wanted to come in? I think we're coming to the end of our time, so you can also have a kind of concluding thoughts.
Sure. No, thanks, Pratap. I actually wanted to, if I could, pick up on there's a question in the chat as well about, could we just do this through a notification under the Environmental Protection Act? And I think that's a nice doorway to actually interrogate the proposition you put out, which is, are we being premature here, thinking about a climate act? And I would actually say that my view is no, but for the following reason. I think there's a little bit of a mental construct here around framework laws that I think it's important to shake free from. And it comes out of the UK experience, which says that the framework law has to have an endpoint articulated, and then the law is organized around how you achieve that endpoint. And I think what's interesting about Olivia Rumble's work in the South Africa case is they say, well, no, actually, a framework law is just meant to set out a common way of approaching this problem. It doesn't have to be oriented around an outcome. And so the underlying construct in South Africa is, how do you more effectively mainstream climate change, right? It's not a greenhouse gas emissions outcome. And I think what's interesting about that, it provides an alternative way of thinking about this and kind of unlocks a lot of possibilities. And so in India, what a framework law that is enabling in that way would do is make it clear, and I think it was Professor Reed who says this, or maybe it was Dr. Rumble, that climate change cannot be an issue that is subjugated or sits under an environment ministry. And so if you have a framework law that actually states that, then it opens up the door to conversations about cross-sectoral intersection in a way that are much more productive and interesting than what is currently the case, where the Environment Ministry begs other ministries to please come to their meetings and have conversations, and only really succeeds in the 2 weeks before an NDC when the Prime Ministerial eye is on the issue, right? So the framework law can kind of open up that space. It can also create the institutional constructs, including the expert committees, to inform that visioning process, because right now it's extremely ad hoc. And it also can create the kind of platforms through which states deliberate. So it doesn't have to be, so yes, there's the possibility of the very overweening kind of procedures that bear down on the little person as opposed to on the culprits. There is that possibility, But I think that's really how, but there's also the possibility of kind of writing this in ways that are enabling, if that is the intention. And I think the worst of all worlds really is to kind of bumble along where we are now, where under the conduct of business regulations in India, climate is the bailiwick of the Environment Ministry, when we all know that decisions by the Coal Ministry, Housing and Urban Development, all kinds of decisions at the states, coastal zone regulations, et cetera, all these things are salient to climate change, but there's no kind of institutional and governance hooks to have those conversations linking all those issues.
No, I mean, I wish we could kind of continue this conversation. I'm actually quite persuaded by, Professor Reed's overall architecture of the things the climate framework can be. I think my diagnosis of what's going on in India is actually very different. First of all, which is that there is always a political decision at the heart of where to place this. And you do not need a law to change that political decision. And if the politics is not aligned, a law is not going to help. So it's a kind of, in a sense, law and society have to meet each other halfway. And but the second thing, I think a little bit more skepticism, given the experience we've had in India the last, and actually even looking at another climate change, because I think one of the interesting things to do is now take all of these framework laws and say what actual effects have they had, and the counterfactuals. The skepticism I have about, I think proceduralism is becoming another technocracy to replace actual hard-nosed politics. That somehow if we get these frameworks in, if we get these vessels in, as it were, right, that will actually lead, the design of them will lead to better deliberation, right? And I see absolutely no evidence that any of those design decisions that we have taken about these vessels in almost any other framing context has actually led to those outcomes. In fact, your work has provided some of the best critiques of the procedural thing, whether we look at electricity or something. And I actually fear that it might actually just be a distraction from actually doing what we need to do, is basically calling the politicians out and say we just need ambitious targets, and we need a hard-nosed look at the political economy of the distributive consequences of these conflicts. But anyway, that's something for another occasion. But we are deeply grateful to our panelists, Dr. Rumble, Professor Park, and Professor Reed, for I think just so splendidly and clearly, I think, laying out the choices India needs to make, the options it can, the examples it can learn from. And it'd be wonderful, I think, to come back maybe a year or so after all these laws have been enacted to see what actual consequences many of these laws have. And thank you, Navroz, Shivani, and Anirudh for organizing this splendid event. Navroz, do you want to say something about future events? Or?
Just to thank you, Pratap, for chairing this. And we have a series of papers. This is the advertisement part of this series of papers on the CPR website around laws, a bunch of op-eds, as well as around institutions, and some other papers forthcoming. Feel free to email us and we'll share those with you. And thank you to all the panelists and to my colleagues at CPR.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to join you.
Thank you.